It was 6:12 in the morning when the kitchen faucet started making that sound again, not the normal hiss of old pipes. This was different, hollow, like the line was coughing air. I remember standing there barefoot on cold tile, coffee grounds already in the filter, listening to the sink sputter while the morning news droned quietly in the background about temporary drought restrictions. Outside, the lawn had already turned brittle from weeks of triple-digit heat. Inside, my wife was filling plastic pitchers from the last few inches of pressure still left in the line. And then it stopped completely. No warning, no drama, just a silence. That's the moment a lot of people realized they were never paying for water. They were paying for permission to access it. But here's the question nobody seems willing to ask. What happens when the system responsible for delivering water can't deliver it anymore? Most people assume the problem is just bad luck, a dry season, aging pipes, maybe poor planning in certain cities. But the deeper I looked into America's water crisis, the harder it became to ignore a much bigger pattern. Over the last 2 decades, the American Southwest has been dealing with what climate researchers now call a megadrought, the driest long-term conditions this region has experienced in centuries. Reservoirs are shrinking. Cities are rationing water. Entire farming communities are fighting over access to groundwater that used to feel endless. And yet somehow, most people still think their rising water bill is the actual problem. It's not. The real problem is dependency. That's the part nobody talks about. Because once you depend entirely on centralized infrastructure for something as basic as water, every drought, blackout, contamination event, or infrastructure failure suddenly becomes personal. I started noticing this years ago after hearing the same story over and over from homeowners, retirees, off-grid builders, even firefighters across California and Arizona. Different people, different lifestyles, same frustration. The system works until it doesn't, and when it fails fast. A guy I spoke with outside Phoenix told me his monthly water bill had nearly doubled in less than 3 years. At first, he blamed himself, thought maybe the irrigation system was leaking, maybe the kids were taking longer showers. So he cut back, shorter watering cycles, timers on the faucets. He even stopped filling the small inflatable pool his grandkids used during the summer. And still the bill kept climbing. Then came the restrictions. No outdoor watering during certain hours. Fines for excessive use. Notices taped to doors during heat waves warning residents about critical consumption thresholds. That's when he said something that stuck with me. I realized I wasn't managing water anymore. I was managing permission. And this is where most people make a mistake that costs them years. They assume conservation alone solves vulnerability. It doesn't, because conservation doesn't create independence. It just stretches dependency a little longer. Then there was a family outside Northern California during wildfire season. They did everything right. Cleared brush, installed vents, followed evacuation prep checklists. But when the fires pushed closer, and they tried turning on their hoses to wet the roofline, almost no pressure. The hydrants nearby had already been drained by emergency crews. Imagine standing in your driveway watching smoke roll over the hills while the thing you assumed would always work suddenly becomes useless. Not because you failed, because the infrastructure failed before you did. The father later admitted the worst part wasn't fear. It was helplessness. That internal voice most people never say out loud. I should have prepared better. But what nobody tells you about modern infrastructure is that redundancy has quietly disappeared from everyday life. Most homes have backup batteries now, backup generators, backup internet, but almost nobody has backup water. And the part that surprised me most was how quickly contamination becomes part of the conversation once supply systems start breaking down. A retired nurse from New Mexico described 3 straight days under a boil water advisory after severe pipeline damage during a heat wave. At first it sounded manageable. Boil water for cooking. Buy bottled water temporarily. Wait for repairs. Except the grocery shelves emptied in hours. Then came confusion. Which water was safe for pets? For showers? For brushing teeth? She told me the psychological exhaustion was worse than the inconvenience, because every basic daily task suddenly required calculation. And after the third day, she started asking herself the same thing millions of Americans quietly ask during every crisis. How are we this unprepared? Now here's what all three of these situations have in common: the rising bills, the fire response failures, the contamination scares. They all trace back to the same root issue: complete dependence on centralized water systems that were never designed for long-term stress at this scale. That's the pattern. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, especially when drought conditions, population growth, aging infrastructure, and energy instability all start colliding at the same time. After hearing enough stories like these, I stopped asking how people could conserve more water. I started asking a different question entirely. Why are we acting like water can only come from pipes? That question led me into a strange rabbit hole involving atmospheric water systems. Devices originally designed for military operations, submarines, and remote environments where traditional supply lines weren't reliable. The basic principle is surprisingly simple. There's moisture in the air around us almost all the time. Atmospheric systems pull the humidity in, cool it through condensation, then collect and filter the resulting water. Not theoretical, not futuristic, just physics. And suddenly a lot of those earlier problems started looking different. The homeowner in Phoenix, instead of obsessing over every gallon coming from the city, he now had a supplemental water source for gardening, cleaning, and emergency storage. The wildfire family, they weren't depending entirely on hydrants staying pressurized during an evacuation window. The retired nurse, she no longer had to panic buy bottled water every time another advisory hit the local news. One story that really stayed with me came from a mechanic in Arizona who built a small atmospheric setup in his garage using salvage parts and basic hardware store components. Nothing fancy. He said the first time he filled a pitcher entirely from collected condensation, it changed the way he thought about water forever, not because it made him off-grid, because for the first time he realized scarcity and dependence weren't necessarily the same thing. And that's what makes this approach fundamentally different from most emergency prep products people waste money on. It's not about stockpiling. It's about creating. Once you understand the principle, a lot of the features people obsess over start becoming natural consequences instead of selling points. No dependence on delivery trucks. No waiting for bottled water shipments. No panic during temporary restrictions. No feeling trapped every time another drought headline appears. Just a different relationship with water itself. Now, at this point, most people have the same objection. They think this kind of system requires engineering experience, expensive equipment, or a dedicated workshop. Honestly, that assumption stops a lot of people before they even look into it. But the reality is usually far less complicated than they imagine. I heard from one couple in Idaho who built a small atmospheric collection system after dealing with repeated well pressure issues during winter freezes. Neither of them had technical backgrounds. He drove trucks for a living. She worked part-time at a school cafeteria. They spent a few weekends learning the basics, piecing together affordable components, and testing different setups. By spring, they had enough supplemental water production to maintain emergency reserves without constantly hauling bottle cases from town. Another story came from a widowed retiree in Southern California living on a fixed income. Her biggest fear wasn't drought itself. It was unpredictability, unexpected restrictions, rising utility costs, emergency shortages during heat waves. She started experimenting with a compact atmospheric setup after seeing how often her town's infrastructure warnings were appearing every summer. The result wasn't some dramatic survivalist transformation. It was peace of mind. And that's really the core principle behind all of this. The people who adapt best during long-term instability are rarely the people with the biggest stockpile. They're the people who reduce dependence before the pressure arrives. If nothing changes over the next 6 months, most people will probably keep doing what they're already doing, paying slightly higher water bills, ignoring another drought warning, buying bottled water during temporary scares, assuming the next outage or restriction will only last a few days, and maybe for a while, that approach still works. But little by little, the mental cost starts adding up, the uncertainty, the lack of control, that quiet feeling in the back of your mind every time another heat wave hits the forecast. Now compare that to someone who spends the next few months simply learning how alternative water systems actually work. Not disappearing into the woods, not building a bunker, just understanding practical ways to create redundancy before they need it. That person experiences the same headlines differently because preparation changes perception. And honestly, you've probably already been doing the hard part, paying attention, researching, trying to think ahead, while most people ignore the problem completely. The issue isn't that you're paranoid. The issue is that most modern systems were built around the assumption that stability would last forever. I don't think people struggling with water insecurity are careless. If anything, most of them have spent years trying to be responsible inside systems that were quietly becoming more fragile the entire time. And sometimes the next step isn't dramatic at all. Sometimes it's just learning how things work before you actually need them to. If you want to see the same atmospheric water approach and resources I've been researching, I left them in the description. And if this conversation made you think differently about where water really comes from, let me know in the comments. I read every one. And if you want more deep dive documentaries like this, subscribe. There's a lot more happening beneath the surface than most people realize.